Guitars. They come in all shapes and sizes. They fit in almost every style of music. And in many cases, there's a unique guitar for each style of music. This guitar is cedar top, Spanish style, nylon string guitar with all of the parts that you've learned. If there's anything extra on this one, it has 2 holes for each string, so a total of 12 at the bridge. It allows me to tie the strings on maybe a little bit more quickly, maybe more effectively with a different type of knot, and I'm told a little different angle behind the saddle to bring out some characteristics. Seems to take me just as long, but it's pretty cool. This is what it sounds like. Let's check out some of these other guitars. This is a 19th century replica instrument. It's much smaller than the standard classical guitar. Of significance, it has a bit of a mustache for a bridge, still has the pins that are used on modern steel strings acoustic guitars. So those are held in by friction. Speaking of friction, friction pegs. This is before the invention of tuners. Figure 8 headstock, much smaller scale, much more petite body. The scale length, everything about these instruments can be comfortable in many ways. Carcassi as it's meant to be played. Can't put too much pressure on these guitars though. My modern hand needs to adjust for a moment. The 19th century guitar. Sword, Giuliani, Carcassi, Carulli, Diabelli. Maybe you. Here is a pretty standard steel string guitar. This one, kind of a copy of a Martin style by the Eastman Company. A much larger body than the classical guitar. Certainly a much larger body than that 19th century, or that earlier, that parlor style guitar. A bit larger in the rear bout. Some of us sit with it on the right leg because of that. There are some that sit left leg with a strap. If I put my foot on my footstool right here, let's hear what this one sounds like, at least finger style. Very harp-like, open, ringy. The steel strings have a much different tone than the nylon. Test. A steel string. Gets a lot louder with a plectrum. I'm not going to do it. This is a strange beast. A Selmac or Selmer-Macaferi style, often referred to as a Django style guitar, named after the great Belgian jazz guitarist Django Reinhardt. This was originally designed by Mario Macaferi and the Selmer Company, same company that makes saxophones and clarinets. This guitar has a kind of a rounded or pliage top, loaded with a lot of tension, and also a bit of that handlebar or mustache bridge. In this case, the bridge itself is floating and it has downward pressure from this tailpiece. So the strings are looped over these posts. This tailpiece is actually attached to the side of the guitar. This one is a really bright spruce and maple. It has a much longer scale. I'm going to grab a little bit of a Django pick here, and it uses strings that are silk and steel. And they're really loud. Here's a big old jazz archtop guitar. So it has a little quality of all of the instruments. It has a big body. It does create a bit of acoustic tone, though designed to be amplified. It has that floating tailpiece, just like the Selmer-Macaferi guitar, has that downward pressure on the bridge, has a hollow body, like a classical. This has a pretty ornate headstock. This is made by the Peerless company. I have a strap on it right now. It has a pickup right up against the neck. And it also has a rather lovely pick guard that helps me adjust for the height of the strings against the top of the guitar. I sort of float my fingers in this style. And again, it does make a good bit of sound. This might be the rarest bird amongst them. It's an electric guitar. I bet you're familiar. Not a hollow body. Doesn't make an awful lot of sound by itself, absolutely intended to be amplified. This is a standard electric guitar. It does have 2 humbucker pickups in it. It is designed to be plugged into an amp. It does not have a headstock to tune. Tuners are actually built in down at the bridge. And there's an interesting little pickup right at that bridge. This is called the Jamstick Studio MIDI, and it's my version of an electric guitar. It converts the strings into MIDI data, and I use it with a software synthesizer. GFAtv at guitarfoundation.org. What do you want to hear more about? What kind of guitars do you want to see and explore? What kind of guitar styles would you like to learn more about? Maybe we'd like to hear from you. Send us photos of your guitars and videos of your guitars to appear in a future episode of GFAtv.
Learning to read music is one of the greatest gifts we can give ourselves. At its best, it's a vehicle for self-discovery and time travel. We as guitarists inherit a near 500-year history that allows us to explore our own emotions and the emotions of the music. Let's start with our musical alphabet. In the Western music tradition, there are 7 unique letters, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. We don't go on to H, we start back at A. And in between those 7 letters, there are 5 other tones that can be labeled one of 2 ways, either as a sharp, which looks like the original hashtag, and a flat, which looks like a lowercase b. How you label these depends on the context, and the context will take some time to understand. To make these sounds more tangible, we created a series of 5 lines called a musical staff. These 5 lines each represent a coordinate for a specific note. But before I can tell you which notes are on which lines, I need to introduce you to this very beautiful looking G, which is known as the treble clef. The treble clef tells us a couple things. This cool little tail end of the treble clef tells us where G is located. That's why it's often called the G clef. And it also tells us if an instrument is higher or lower pitched. So a treble clef is going to be higher pitched and a bass clef will be lower pitched. So even though our instrument can play some pretty low notes, we still write all of our music on treble clef. So now we know about our 12 notes, our 7 unique letters, our 5-line staff, and our treble clef. Let's put some notes down. We represent these sounds or these notes with these circular symbols that will fit on one of the 5 lines or 4 spaces of our musical staff. The letters that fit on the lines for the treble clef are E, G, B, D, and F. The phrase that echoes throughout all of history is "every good boy does fine." You may be having a flashback right now, actually. And similarly, the notes that fit in between the lines on the spaces are F, A, C, E, and we say face fits in the space. We run into a quick problem though, and you'll have to trust me for a moment, but every good boy does fine takes me to here. So what about all the notes above fine? And what about all the notes below every? We have a solution for that. We create this wonderful solution of adding additional lines above or below the staff for notes that are on the extreme of our range, and we call these ledger lines. So if we know where F is, we can just follow our musical alphabet, where a letter higher than F is G. And a letter higher than G, that's right, not H, we're going back to A. And now this note is resting on a line so the staff doesn't get too big. And if A is on a line, that means B is going to be on a space. And if C is now on a line, D is now in a space, and so on and so forth. Notice something interesting. Before, we said face fits in the space, but when the pattern repeats itself a little bit higher, everything is on the lines now. F, A, C, E, all on the lines. But I think you'll agree that face fits in the space is more memorable than face fits on the lines. And the same is true for notes lower than E in the alphabet. So here we are at every or at E, and below E we have D. Below D in the alphabet we have C on our first free-floating ledger line right here. Below C I have B, now in a space. Below that I have A, 2 ledger lines down, and no H through Z business here. I go on to G, F, and E, all with these free-floating ledger lines. Recap with me now. We have 12 notes, 7 unique letters, a 5-line staff with a treble clef where every good boy does fine and face fits in the space, and all notes above or below the staff are negotiated with, that's right, ledger lines. Thanks so much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you on the next video.
Hi guys, I'm Marco Piperno from a little town near Lecce, in Italy. First of all, I'm sorry for my English, but the music is universal, and as we will see, luckily for me, many terms are in Italian. When Marta Masters proposed me to do some video for the American school, I thought, it's incredible, but when she proposed me a STEM, the basic Italian terms, I was very enthusiastic, especially as an Italian guitarist. Then I started to think at my study, how many Italian terms there are in music. I was impressed because an Italian student doesn't think this many times, because the language is the same. There are not many studies about this, but the music dictionaries of the 1700, the Rousseau and the Brossard. One of the most important reasons was at the success of the very important Italian composer of the 1600, such as Vivaldi, Corelli, Torelli, Albinoni, and especially because the printing of a score in that time was very expensive, and many following composers like Bach copied and studied the score, note to note and terms to terms. I will do some example, and sometime I will play something to understand each other better. To simplify, we will divide in 4 categories this class: directions and moods, dynamics, time, and articulations. Now we'll talk about the moods and directions. On the upper left of the scores, an expression like andante, allegretto, grazioso, and many times we also find them in the scores between the pentagram. The first case shows the character of the whole piece and the time approximately. The second one shows the character and at that precise moment. Now we will understand some little but important difference among amabile, appassionato, amoroso, grazioso, scherzoso, scherzo. For example, this year the obligatory piece at the GFA competition was Caprice Variation by George Rochberg, transcribed by Elliot Fisk. Here we can find 51 variations, and all of them have different movements. This makes us understand how the indication can be important to diversify the interpretation of the piece, even under a sentimental point of view. In these variations, there is one of my favorites, Andante Amoroso. Andante establishes the time, that is walking speed, moderately slow, and Amoroso the character, with love, con amore, with every sentiment that for us and especially for you is the love. This is my interpretation of Andante Amoroso. Another important example that we can do is Manuel Ponce's Sonatina Meridionale and Sonata Romantica, where we can find many of these terms. In the first movement of the Meridionale, we see printed on a scale grazioso. That means that the composer doesn't want a speed scale flamenco style, but a graceful one, grazioso. I don't know in America how you use this term, but in Italy, for example, is used as describing for a cute child. Instead, the title of the third movement of Sonata Romantica is Scherzo, joke, and in the third movement of Sonatina Meridionale, between the pentagrams, we find ironico or scherzoso, playful, ironic. The first one is different from the second one. Scherzo is a movement of sonata in 4 movements and means that the time is in 3, 1, 2, 3, with an important accent normally in the first movement. But the character is not always funny. For example, etc. Instead, in the meridional, scherzoso means playful in a way that almost make you laugh. For example, there are many terms that I would like to examine it with you, but the time is finished, so see you at the next episode.
In this video, I'll be guiding you through the technique of rest stroke. I'll start off by talking a little bit about how I personally visualize the stroke, a couple exercises that I find really useful for the stroke, and lastly, when to apply the stroke. So for the visualization of rest stroke, I find that the visualization of snapping your finger onto the neck string as really useful. Now, rest stroke is, I feel, a much more intuitive stroke than free stroke because you have somewhere a little anchor point to anchor onto. Like, you get to anchor onto the neck string. Now, this is a lot more intuitive for a lot of beginner guitarists, and that makes it why, in the beginning, many beginner guitarists start off by using rest stroke. Now, rest stroke, it produces, because you're able to snap onto the neck string, a much louder sound than free stroke, and oftentimes it gives you a much more full tone as well. That's something that we'll find really helps out guitarists in a lot of ways, especially with bringing out the melody in a piece of music. The first exercise I'll be showing you today is from Scott Tennant's Pumping Nylon book. If you don't already know this book, it's a really useful technique book that I think I owe a lot of my current technique abilities to. The technique I'll show you today is the speed burst. It's a really simple exercise. You just play a couple notes on the G string, few notes are 16th notes. Now, these get progressively harder. That was only the first one. The second one has 6. The next one has 8, 10. It basically progressively increases in difficulty. What I like to do is, for each one, I like to increase the tempo incrementally each time by about 10 beats per minute. This way you can work your way up to some really fast tempos. The second exercise that I'll be showing you today are the rest stroke chromatic scales. Now, these chromatic scales, you just play triplets, and then you go all the way down to E, and then you come back up to the high E. Now, this exercise seems pretty self-explanatory. However, there are a couple things that might seem a little tricky when you first do it. For example, string crossings may be a little bit rough. Something I find useful to counter that is when you cross strings, make sure to note which finger you last play with, and then you play the next string with the other finger, and then keep doing that. That's something I find to be really useful. This was probably one of the very first exercises that I've ever learned, and I think it's really helped to me when I've had to do faster rest stroke scales like 827 by Villalobos. Something like that. Although it still took a lot of work. I think the main thing to take away from these scales is string crossings and speed. You can also do the increments of around 10 beats per minute per repetition. You can maybe see how fast you can go with it. Now, there's a particular reason why these rest stroke exercises are more focused on speed and dexterity rather than tone production. And that's because rest stroke tone production in general is much more intuitive than free stroke tone production. You're able to automatically get a much deeper, fuller, and warmer sound, as well as loudness. This doesn't mean you don't have to practice rest stroke tone production. That's still a really important part. This brings me to my next point, though, that there are certain times when you should apply rest stroke and certain times when you should not. If a piece is too technically difficult, if there are too many moving lines, if it's just impossible to apply rest stroke, then you don't really have much of a choice, even if you want to bring out something. However, if a piece is slower and you want to bring out the melody, or it's easier to bring out the melody, then you should definitely use rest stroke, like El Testament d'Amelia by Lobet. Rest stroke can also be useful in bringing out particular notes of a piece, of a particular scale maybe, or a particular run you have in the piece. So rest stroke, you have to make some technical and musical decisions about it. Rest stroke is probably harder to do technically in a faster part of the piece. However, it definitely contributes a lot to the musicality of the piece, to which notes are being brought out. Thank you so much for watching today. I really enjoyed talking to you a little bit about rest stroke. I hope to see you again soon, and thank you for watching.